Imagine a place so remote, so hidden from the world, that what happened there defied every known rule of human biology. Kentucky, 1897. A tiny woman, barely taller than a child, and a man trapped inside 500 pounds of flesh brought 12 lives into this world. But these weren't ordinary births. Each child arrived bearing marks that made even seasoned physicians question what they knew about heredity, about nature, about the limits of human survival. One child with organs arranged in reverse, another with a spine twisted into impossible angles, twins whose skulls never formed right, whose bodies seemed assembled from the wrong blueprint entirely. Not one, not a single one of those 12 children, escaped unscathed. When a country doctor finally discovered this family hidden deep in the Kentucky hollows, he thought he'd stumbled upon the medical mystery of the century. He had no idea the firestorm it would unleash, or that this forgotten family would spark debates about science, ethics, and what it means to be human that still echo today. This is their story, the one history tried to bury. Before we go further, if stories like this fascinate you, stories that uncover the incredible, often heartbreaking truths hidden in medical history, you're in exactly the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss these deep dives. And I'm curious, where are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. Let's see how far this community reaches. March 1897. Dr. Samuel Garrett had seen plenty in his 15 years practicing medicine in Harlan County, Kentucky. Broken bones from mining accidents, fevers that swept through entire families, children who didn't make it past their first winter. This was mountain country, rough, unforgiving, where life came hard and death came easy. But what walked into his office that cold morning was different. A farmer, someone Garrett recognized from town, stood in the doorway shifting his weight like a man carrying a secret too heavy to hold. He wouldn't meet the doctor's eyes, just kept looking at his boots, at the floor, anywhere but straight ahead. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost apologetic. There was a family, he said, living way out past Pine Mountain, deep in one of those hollows where sunlight barely reached the ground. Something was wrong with them. Not sick exactly. Wrong. Every single child in that house, and there were many, bore marks that made the farmer's skin crawl. He'd only seen them once, by accident, when he'd gotten turned around hunting and stumbled near their property. What he saw haunted him enough to make this trip into town, to bring it to someone who might understand, or at least witness it. Garrett's first instinct was dismissal. Rural communities bred tall tales, especially about isolated families. Superstition filled gaps where medical knowledge ended, and mountain people were prone to seeing curses and divine punishment in what were often just unfortunate coincidences. But something in the farmer's demeanor, the genuine disturbance in his voice, the way his hands shook slightly, made Garrett pause. This wasn't embellishment or gossip. This was a man who'd seen something that violated his understanding of what human beings should look like. Against his better judgment, against the voice in his head that said this was probably nothing, Garrett agreed to investigate. He packed his medical bag, saddled his horse, and followed the farmer's directions into territory he'd never explored. The journey ate up most of the day. The path, if you could even call it that, was barely wide enough for his horse, carved into mountainside at angles that made him grip the reins tighter than necessary. Oak and hickory trees pressed in from both sides, their branches interlocking overhead until the afternoon sun became nothing but scattered coins of light on the forest floor. This was the kind of remote that came with intention. You didn't end up here by accident. You came here to disappear. When the trees finally opened up, Garrett found himself staring at a homestead that looked almost normal at first glance. A crude cabin, yes, but maintained. Smoke curling from a stone chimney. A small garden plot. Chickens scratching in the dirt. But then the door opened, and normal ended. The woman who stepped out to greet him stood no higher than his waist. His immediate assumption was that she was a child, perhaps the oldest daughter sent to meet the stranger. But as she came closer, that assumption shattered. Her face was adult, weathered. Lines around her eyes spoke of years, not childhood. Her proportions were compressed, as if someone had taken a fully grown woman and shrunk her down to a size that seemed biologically impossible. She stood maybe 4 feet tall, if that. And when she spoke, her voice carried the weariness of someone much older than her years. She asked if he was the doctor. She'd been expecting someone, eventually. People always came, Once the rumors started spreading, Garrett introduced himself, trying to keep his professional composure, trying not to stare. But medical training was screaming at him. This wasn't malnutrition or stunted growth from poverty. This was something fundamental, something written into her very biology from the beginning. She led him inside, and that's when Garrett understood why the farmer had made that trip into town. The interior of the cabin was dim, lit by the fireplace and a single window. And there, occupying a chair that looked like it had been reinforced with extra wood, sat a man whose size defied belief. He wasn't just heavy. He was architecturally impossible. Garrett estimated his weight at over 500 pounds, maybe more. His body sprawled across a space meant for multiple people, flesh cascading in ways that spoke of a metabolism gone catastrophically wrong. His breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort. Swollen joints, skin stretched taut. This wasn't simple obesity from overeating. This was a body betrayed by its own systems, unable to stop growing, unable to regulate itself. The man, Benjamin, his wife called him, nodded at Garrett with surprising gentleness in his eyes, as if apologizing for what the doctor was about to witness. And then the children emerged. Not all at once. They moved through the cabin's shadows like ghosts, and each one stopped Garrett's breath. A girl, perhaps 14, walked with a spinal curve so severe her torso twisted nearly sideways. Twin boys dragged themselves across the floor because their feet, clubbed and deformed, wouldn't support normal walking. A younger child held up hands where fingers had fused together into paddle-like masses. Another child's skull was misshapen, bulging in places, flattened in others, in ways that made Garrett wonder how the brain inside could possibly function normally. Yet they did function. They spoke. They looked at him with awareness, with personality. They were profoundly, devastatingly disabled, and somehow, impossibly, alive. Garrett spent 3 hours in that cabin, and with each passing minute, his medical certainty crumbled a little more. With the parents' permission, given quietly, resignedly, as if they'd long accepted that their family would be examined like specimens, he conducted evaluations that filled his notebook with observations he could barely believe he was writing. Every child displayed multiple abnormalities. Not just one condition, but combinations that his training told him should be incompatible with life. The girl with the twisted spine also had organs that seemed displaced when he palpated her abdomen. One of the twins had a cranium so soft in places that Garrett feared applying even gentle pressure. A younger boy's joints bent in directions joints weren't designed to bend, as if the ligaments holding him together had formed incorrectly. Another child had eyes that couldn't focus properly, pupils that reacted sluggishly to light, suggesting neurological complications beneath the surface. Some showed signs of conditions he'd only read about in obscure medical texts imported from Europe, things he never expected to see in a Kentucky hollow. And the parents just watched him work, answering his questions with the tired patience of people who'd stopped hoping for miracles a long time ago. What struck Garrett most, what would haunt him in the weeks to come, wasn't just the medical impossibility of it all. It was the atmosphere in that cabin. Despite everything, despite the parade of physical catastrophes, there was something almost normal about the family dynamics. The children bickered like siblings do. The mother moved through the space with practiced efficiency, tending to one child's needs, then another's, in a choreography born of necessity. Benjamin, immobile in his chair, still functioned as a kind of anchor point. Children came to him with questions, seeking comfort, showing him things they'd found outside. There was love here, affection, humanity, and that somehow made it worse. These weren't abstract medical cases in a textbook. These were real people, living real lives, trapped in bodies that had betrayed them before they'd even had a chance. How do you reconcile that? How do you see a child smile at you with a face that's fundamentally misshapen, hear them speak despite a palate that never formed right, watch them play despite limbs that barely function, and maintain clinical distance? As darkness fell and Garrett prepared to leave, gathering his instruments and closing his notebook, Sarah, the mother, asked him a question that would echo in his mind for years afterward. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic, as if she was embarrassed to even ask. Could medicine explain why God had cursed them so? Why had every single one of their children been born this way? What had they done to deserve this? Garrett had no answer. He'd witnessed births with complications. He'd seen genetic conditions passed from parent to child. But this? A family where catastrophic abnormality wasn't the exception but the absolute, unbending rule? We're not one child out of, he'd counted. At least 8 or 9 had escaped unscathed. His medical training offered no framework for understanding it. The textbooks had nothing. His professors had never mentioned anything like this. He told Sarah, as gently as he could, that he didn't know, that he would research it, consult with colleagues, try to find answers. But standing there in that dim cabin, surrounded by children who shouldn't exist, yet somehow did, he felt the full weight of medicine's limitations. Sometimes nature conducted experiments that human understanding simply couldn't catch up to. Sometimes the only honest answer was, I don't know. The ride back to town felt longer than the journey there, even though Garrett pushed his horse harder than he should have. His mind kept circling back to what he'd witnessed, trying to fit it into some logical framework and failing repeatedly. 2 parents, each with severe conditions of their own. Conditions so extreme they'd been cast out by their families, forced to the margins of society. And together they'd created, what? A genetic catastrophe that compounded with each pregnancy? How was that even possible? Garrett knew the basics of heredity, of course. Traits passed from parent to child. Certain conditions ran in families. But this went beyond anything he'd learned. This suggested something darker, more complex, as if the very act of these 2 particular people reproducing had triggered some kind of biological chain reaction that doomed every child they conceived. By the time he reached his office, Garrett had made a decision. This wasn't something he could keep to himself. This was unprecedented, potentially the most important hereditary case study in modern medicine. He needed to document it properly, bring in experts, figure out what was happening, and, maybe, if there was any mercy in the world, find some way to help that family. He had no idea, sitting there in his office that night, filling out his initial report by lamplight, that his discovery would spark debates that would rage for years, that it would be weaponized by people with agendas he couldn't imagine, that the Caldwell family, as he would come to know them, would become a symbol in arguments about science, ethics, and what society owed to those born different. All he knew was that somewhere in those Kentucky mountains, a family was surviving against impossible odds, and medicine needed to understand why. What he'd witnessed wasn't just tragic. It was scientifically extraordinary. And Dr. Samuel Garrett, a country physician who'd spent 15 years treating routine ailments in rural Kentucky, had just stumbled onto something that would define the rest of his career. The question was, what would he do with it? And more importantly, what would it do to the family he'd just discovered? After that first visit, Garrett couldn't let it go. The family consumed his thoughts in a way no case ever had. He'd wake up at night thinking about those children, about the parents, about the sheer statistical impossibility of what he'd witnessed. But to understand what was happening, he needed to understand how it started. How did 2 people, each carrying such extreme genetic burdens, even find each other? What chain of circumstances had led them to that remote hollow, to that cabin, to those 12 pregnancies that would all end in tragedy? So Garrett did what any obsessed physician would do. He started digging. He conducted interviews with the parents separately, gently extracting their histories over multiple visits. He wrote letters to hospitals, charities, county clerks, anyone who might have records. And what emerged was a story that felt almost cruelly designed by fate. 2 people, both cast aside by a world that had no place for them, finding each other in the one institution that warehoused the unwanted. It read like something from a novel, except the consequences were devastatingly real. Sarah's story began in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1871. Born to a working-class family, her father was a dock worker, her mother took in laundry. She seemed normal enough at first. A small baby, yes, but babies came in all sizes. It was only as the months passed that her parents realized something was wrong. She wasn't growing, not the way she should. Other children her age were crawling, then walking, gaining weight and height at predictable intervals. Sarah stayed tiny, alarmingly tiny. By age 2, she was the size of a 6-month-old. By age 3, her parents were desperate enough to take her to Children's Hospital of Cincinnati, where physicians examined her with the kind of clinical fascination that must have felt dehumanizing even to a toddler. The diagnosis, when it came, offered a name but no comfort: primordial dwarfism. An incredibly rare condition, fewer than 24 documented cases in all of American medical literature at that time. Sarah's body simply refused to grow beyond the proportions of a very small child. Her bones, her organs, everything compressed into a frame that would never reach even 4 feet tall. But here's the cruel twist. Her mind was fine. Completely, utterly normal. She understood that she was different, that people stared, that children pointed and laughed. She was trapped in a body the world treated as less than human, fully aware of every moment of it. Garrett found her childhood medical file through correspondence with a Cincinnati hospital, and reading it made him angry in ways he didn't expect. Page after page of measurements, observations, physicians noting every detail of her development with the detached curiosity of scientists studying an exotic specimen. They measured her head circumference, her limb proportions, her bone density. They tracked her cognitive development, almost surprised to find it normal. They photographed her at various ages, adding her to their collection of medical oddities. And through it all, there's barely any mention of Sarah as a person. No notes about whether she was scared during these examinations, whether she cried, whether anyone thought to comfort her or explain what was happening in terms a child could understand. She was a case study, a data point. And as she got older, as it became clear that her condition wasn't going to improve or resolve, her family's ability to cope deteriorated. Her father drank more. Her mother grew bitter, exhausted by the constant curiosity and cruelty their daughter attracted. Neighbors whispered. Other children were forbidden from playing with her. By the time Sarah turned 15, her parents made a decision that Garrett found heartbreaking even reading about it decades later. They gave her up. They contacted a religious charity in Louisville, Kentucky, one that operated a home for individuals deemed unmarriageable or unable to support themselves, and they sent their daughter away. Just like that. The file contained a single letter from her mother, brief and businesslike, requesting placement and citing the family's inability to care for a daughter who would never be independent. There was no mention of love, of regret, of difficulty with the decision. Just, we can't manage her anymore. Take her off our hands. Benjamin's story was different, but somehow equally tragic. Born in 1865 to a farming family in Breathitt County, Kentucky, he had a completely normal childhood. Not just normal, by all accounts, he was healthy, active, helpful around the farm. His mother's diary, which Garrett later obtained through family connections, described a boy who loved working with the animals, who had a gentle way with the younger children, who never complained about the hard work farm life demanded. For 12 years, Benjamin was just a regular kid. And then, around age 13, something in his body went catastrophically wrong. It started with hunger, not regular hunger, but an insatiable, consuming need to eat that never felt satisfied. His mother wrote about it with mounting horror, describing how Benjamin would finish a full meal and immediately ask for more. How he'd wake up in the middle of the night, crying from hunger pains, raiding the pantry for anything he could find. How no amount of food ever seemed to be enough. And with the eating came weight gain that defied all logic. He doubled his weight within a year, then doubled it again. By 16, he was over 300 pounds. By 20, he exceeded 400. His body just kept growing, expanding, as if some internal mechanism that was supposed to regulate growth had been permanently switched to on, with no way to turn it off. His family tried everything, and the diary entries document their increasingly desperate attempts. They restricted his food, rationing his portions even as he begged and cried from hunger. They consulted local healers who prescribed herbal remedies that did nothing. They even tried a brutal regimen of forced physical labor, making Benjamin work the fields from dawn to dusk, hoping exhaustion and exertion would somehow reset his metabolism. It didn't work. He'd work himself to the point of collapse, and the weight stayed. His joints began to swell from supporting mass they were never designed to carry. His breathing grew labored. His skin stretched and stretched, marked with angry red lines where it couldn't keep up with the expansion beneath. In 1887, when Benjamin was 22, his father took him to a physician in Lexington, a considerable journey and expense for a farming family. The doctor's examination, preserved in Kentucky Medical Society archives, noted what he termed pituitary dysfunction, though the medical understanding of such conditions in the 1880s was primitive at best. The physician theorized that Benjamin's pituitary gland, a tiny structure at the base of the brain that regulates growth and metabolism, was sending constant, overwhelming signals to grow, to eat, to expand. His body was essentially at war with itself, following instructions that would eventually destroy it. There was no treatment, no cure, just a diagnosis and a grim prognosis. This would continue until his organs failed under the strain. By 1888, Benjamin's father faced a decision similar to the one Sarah's parents had made. His son consumed resources meant for 6 people. He could no longer perform meaningful farm work. He required constant care that the family couldn't sustain while also managing their land and other children. So Benjamin's father, and you can almost feel his anguish in the arrangements he made, contacted the same Louisville charity that housed Sarah. He asked for his son's placement, citing the family's inability to care for someone with such extreme needs. The charity agreed. And just like that, Benjamin was sent away from the only home he'd known, transported to Louisville to live among strangers in an institution designed for people society had given up on. Can you imagine that journey? A young man who'd done nothing wrong, whose only crime was a body that betrayed him, being sent away because his very existence had become too burdensome? The charity home where they ended up was, by all accounts, grim. Not cruel, necessarily, but institutional in the worst sense. A place where people who didn't fit anywhere else were warehoused until they died. The residents included the severely disabled, the mentally ill, the elderly with no family, the disfigured, anyone deemed unable to function in normal society. It was crowded, underfunded, run by well-meaning but overwhelmed administrators who viewed their charges more as obligations than as people. Meals were basic, medical care minimal, privacy non-existent. The residents lived in dormitory-style rooms, sleeping on cots, following strict schedules, filling their days with whatever simple tasks they could manage. It was a place to survive, not to live. And yet, somehow, in that bleak institution, Sarah and Benjamin found each other. Garrett never got the full story of how they met. Both were private about it, as if that one piece of their history was too precious to share with a doctor who'd come to examine their children. But the basic facts are clear from charity records. They met in 1888. Sarah was 17, having been at the home for 2 years. Benjamin was 23, newly arrived, and still adjusting to institutional life. And somehow, these two people, both rejected by their families, both trapped in bodies that society viewed as grotesque, saw something in each other that everyone else had missed. Sarah saw past Benjamin's enormous size to the gentle, kind man inside. Someone who spoke softly, who helped other residents when he could despite his limited mobility, who'd taught himself to read during his time there and would share stories with anyone who'd listen. Benjamin, for perhaps the first time in years, encountered someone who didn't recoil from his presence. Someone who looked at him and saw a person, not a medical disaster. Someone small and vulnerable who needed protection in a place that wasn't always kind to the weak. They became friends first, spending time together in the common areas, talking in ways that came naturally when both people understood what it meant to be stared at, pitted, rejected. The charity administrators, perhaps recognizing something genuine between them, or perhaps just relieved to reduce their burden by 2 residents, permitted them to marry in 1889. The wedding was simple, performed by a local minister in the charity's chapel, witnessed by a handful of other residents. No family attended from either side. Sarah wore a dress donated by the charity. Benjamin could barely fit into any formal clothing, but wore his cleanest shirt. There's a note in the charity's records that someone donated a small wedding cake, and the other residents celebrated with them as best they could. It was, by any measure, a modest affair. But for Sarah and Benjamin, it represented something profound: choice. For once in their lives, they'd made a decision about their own futures. They'd chosen each other when the world had chosen to discard them both. The charity provided them with donated supplies, basic furniture, cooking implements, some clothing, and arranged for them to leave Louisville. Benjamin had distant cousins in Harlan County who'd reluctantly agreed to let the couple build a cabin on unused land at the edge of their property. It wasn't generosity so much as obligation. Family ties stretched thin but not quite broken. So Sarah and Benjamin made their way to the most remote hollow they could find, where they could live without constant judgment, without people staring, without the daily reminder that they didn't belong. They built their cabin, or rather, Benjamin's cousins built it while Benjamin directed and Sarah helped where she could. They established a small homestead, keeping chickens, planting a garden, creating something that resembled a life. And then, in 1890, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. Garrett learned all of this through patient interviews, through letters and records requested from various institutions, through conversations with people who'd known the couple peripherally. And as he pieced together their histories, a troubling picture emerged. Both parents carried genetic abnormalities so severe that their own families couldn't cope. Both had been institutionalized, cast out, marked as less than fully human. Both had retreated to isolation where society's judgment couldn't reach them. And both, whether through ignorance of biology, religious conviction against preventing pregnancy, or simply the very human desire to create a family, had decided to have children. The medical literature of 1897 offered no guidance for such a scenario. Heredity was poorly understood. Gregor Mendel's groundbreaking work on genetic inheritance, published decades earlier, had been largely ignored by the medical establishment. Nobody could predict what would happen when two people carrying such extreme genetic burdens tried to reproduce together. Would the children inherit one parent's condition? Both? Neither? Something entirely new? Sarah and Benjamin had no way of knowing they were conducting an experiment nature itself had designed, one of the cruelest experiments imaginable. They just wanted a family. They wanted children to love, to raise, to give a better life than they'd had. They wanted normalcy in whatever form it might take. And what they got, starting with that first pregnancy in 1890, was a genetic catastrophe that would play out over 12 births, creating a family that medical science could document but not understand, observe but not help. Garrett closed his research notes on their backgrounds with a single question written in the margin. Had anyone warned them what might happen? And if they'd known, would they have chosen differently? It was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Because now, sitting in his office with the full picture of how Sarah and Benjamin had come together, he understood something that made his chest tight. This wasn't a story of reckless parents or willful ignorance. This was a story of two deeply wounded people who'd found something precious: love, companionship, the basic human right to build a life together, and who'd paid a price for it that no one should ever have to pay. Their crime was hoping. Their punishment was watching that hope twist into nightmare with each child they brought into the world. Spring, 1890. Sarah discovered she was pregnant, and for a brief moment, the world must have felt full of possibility. She and Benjamin had built something together: a home, a life, a partnership that worked despite everything stacked against them. Now they'd create a family. Martha Combs, the local midwife whose detailed logbook would become an invaluable historical record, noted the pregnancy in her entries with what reads like cautious optimism. Sarah was young, healthy aside from her size. Benjamin's condition, while severe, was his burden alone. There was no reason to think it would affect a child. The medical understanding of heredity in 1890 was primitive enough that nobody really knew what to expect. Maybe the baby would be small like Sarah. Maybe large like Benjamin. Maybe, just maybe, perfectly normal. Hope is a dangerous thing when biology has other plans. As the pregnancy progressed, that hope began to crack. Sarah's already tiny frame struggled to accommodate the growing child in ways that worried Martha from the start. By the 6th month, Sarah could barely walk. Her compressed skeletal structure simply wasn't designed for this. Her pelvis, narrow to begin with, would make delivery complicated. Benjamin, largely immobile at this point, could offer emotional support but little physical help. He'd watch Sarah move around the cabin, each step clearly painful, and you can only imagine the helplessness he felt. This massive man unable to ease his wife's burden, unable to do anything but wait and hope alongside her. The birth came in January 1891, and Martha's notes from that night are clinically precise in a way that somehow makes them more horrifying. Labor lasted 36 hours. 36 hours of Sarah's tiny body trying to do something it was never built for, while Martha worked with increasingly desperate efficiency to help. The baby's presentation was unusual, not the normal head-down position that makes delivery straightforward, but angled in a way that complicated everything. Martha had to manually reposition the infant multiple times, her experienced hands working inside Sarah's body while the mother screamed through contractions that seemed to go on forever. Benjamin, confined to his chair in the next room, could hear everything. Every cry, every moment of agony. Unable to help, unable to even hold his wife's hand because his size made it impossible to navigate the small birthing room. When the boy finally emerged, Martha's practiced hands detected the problem immediately, even before she'd fully cleared his airway. His feet. They curved inward so severely that the soles faced each other. The ankle bones twisted at angles that nature never intended. The medical term was talipes echinovarus, club feet, but that clinical language couldn't capture the severity of what Martha was seeing. These weren't mild deformities that bracing might correct. These were feet that had formed fundamentally wrong, bones and tendons arranged in configurations that would make normal walking impossible. Martha cleaned the baby, swaddled him, and placed him in Sarah's arms. And here's where the story takes a turn that tells you everything about who Sarah was as a person. She looked at her son's twisted feet, at the deformity that would mark him for life, and she wept, not from disappointment or horror, but from relief. He was alive. He was breathing. He had survived a delivery that had nearly killed them both. In that moment, survival was blessing enough. They named him James. Despite his club feet, he nursed normally. He gained weight. His eyes tracked movement the way infant eyes should. Apart from his feet, he seemed healthy. Sarah convinced herself that this was manageable. Lots of children were born with problems, right? Club feet weren't ideal, but James was alive, and she'd find ways to help him adapt. Benjamin, holding his son for the first time, cradling the tiny body against his massive chest, felt something similar. Yes, the feet were wrong, but the boy was strong. He'd survive. They'd make it work. Martha Combs, however, wrote something in her logbook that suggests she saw what the parents couldn't yet accept, or perhaps what they refused to accept because accepting it would be unbearable. She noted the severity of James's deformity, then added a line that reads almost like a premonition. God have mercy on what comes next. Sarah became pregnant again barely 6 months after James's birth. When Martha found out during a routine visit, her reaction was strong enough that she documented it. She expressed concerns, diplomatic, professional concerns, but concerns nonetheless. Sarah's body had barely recovered from the first pregnancy. The delivery had been traumatic. She needed time to heal, to regain strength. And there was the unspoken question hanging between them. What if the next child had problems too? Sarah dismissed the concerns. Not angrily, just dismissed them. She was young. She'd survived the first birth. And James, for all his difficulty, was thriving. She'd take whatever came. Whether this was faith, denial, or simply the acceptance that came from a lifetime of having no control over her own circumstances, Martha couldn't tell. But she noted it in her log, and you can feel her worry in the careful way she phrased everything. She was watching something unfold that her experience told her might not end well, but she had no authority to stop it. Her job was to help bring children safely into the world, not to decide who should or shouldn't have them. The second pregnancy progressed similarly to the first, difficult, painful for Sarah, marked by complications that came from trying to fit a growing child into a body that wasn't designed for it. The birth came in May 1892, and this time Martha knew what to look for. As soon as the baby girl emerged, she checked the feet first. Clubbed, just like James. Severe, bilateral club feet that twisted inward at impossible angles. But there was something else. Something Martha hadn't seen in James. The baby's spine curved unnaturally to the left, creating a visible hump between her shoulder blades even in a newborn. Scoliosis, though Martha wouldn't have known that medical term. She just knew that the spine was wrong, bent in a way that would worsen as the child grew, that would twist her torso and compress her organs and cause pain that would never stop. 2 children, 2 births, 2 sets of severe abnormalities. Martha looked at Sarah, lying exhausted on the bed, and she didn't know what to say. How do you tell a mother that the pattern she's hoping is coincidence might be something worse? How do you suggest that maybe, just maybe, there's something about her and Benjamin's union that's producing these results? Sarah took her daughter, examined the club feet and the curved spine with trembling hands, and started to cry. Not the relieved tears from James's birth. These were different. These were tears that came from understanding beginning to dawn. Benjamin, when he saw his daughter, held her with the same gentleness he'd shown James, but Martha noted that he asked questions this time. Questions about why both children had club feet, whether there was something that could be done, whether the next baby might be different. Martha had no answers. Medical science in 1892 couldn't explain what was happening. All she could do was provide the care she'd been trained to give and hope, though her hope was fading fast, that this was as bad as it would get. Word began spreading through the isolated mountain communities. News traveled slowly in those hollows. carried by the occasional traveling merchant, by families who visited each other across the miles, by the informal network of gossip that connected even the most remote homesteads. People who'd initially shown the Caldwells neighborly kindness, bringing supplies, helping with heavy work, offering the basic support that mountain communities extended to everyone, started to grow distant. It wasn't overt at first, just cooler. Visits became less frequent. Offers of help dried up. The change accelerated when Sarah gave birth to twin boys in March 1893, and both emerged with cranial malformations that made Martha's hands shake as she cleaned them. Their skulls were misshapen, bulging in some areas, flattened in others, foreheads grotesquely prominent in a way that suggested the bones had fused incorrectly or developed along paths they were never meant to follow. The twins, David and Daniel, displayed matching abnormalities, as if whatever genetic instructions had gone wrong identically in both. Their eyes were set too far apart. Their heads were disproportionately large for their tiny bodies. And even in those first days, Martha could tell their development was lagging. They didn't respond to stimuli the way newborns should. Their cries were weaker. Something about them just seemed off. The whispers in the community turned to open judgment. One woman, Martha recorded this in her log, clearly disturbed by it, told her flat out that God was punishing an unnatural union, that people like Sarah and Benjamin should never have been allowed to marry, much less have children, that their offspring were proof of divine displeasure, physical manifestations of sin or curse or cosmic wrongness. It was cruel, ignorant superstition, but it was also the kind of explanation that made sense to people who couldn't understand genetics or heredity. If something this wrong kept happening, there had to be a reason. And in communities steeped in religious interpretation of the world, that reason was often framed as judgment. Martha pushed back against such talk when she heard it, defending the Caldwells as good people dealing with circumstances beyond their control. But she couldn't stop the tide of opinion turning against them. Families began forbidding their children from going near the Caldwell property, warning them that whatever curse afflicted that household might somehow spread. The isolation that had begun as a choice, Sarah and Benjamin seeking privacy in a remote hollow, was becoming involuntary quarantine. The community was slowly, methodically cutting them off. By the time Martha attended the fourth pregnancy in 1894, her logbook entries had changed in tone. The cautious optimism was gone. The professional distance she'd maintained was cracking. She wrote about feeling complicit in ongoing tragedy, about lying awake at night wondering if she should refuse to attend further births, about the moral weight of helping bring children into the world when she knew they'd be born suffering. But what was the alternative? If she refused, Sarah would deliver alone or with unskilled help, and both mother and infant would likely die. At least with Martha present, they had a chance of survival, even if survival meant life in a body that would never work right. The fourth child, a girl born in November 1894, had hands unlike anything Martha had documented before. The fingers had failed to separate properly during development, remaining fused together into paddle-like appendages with only slight indentations where individual digits should have been. Syndactyly, though again, Martha wouldn't have known the medical term. She just knew that this child would never hold things properly, never write, never perform the countless small tasks that required individual finger function. And she had other issues too. Her reflexes were weak, her muscle tone poor, signs that suggested neurological problems beyond the obvious physical deformity. For children, for pregnancies, for catastrophic outcomes, the pattern was undeniable now, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or bad luck. Something about Sarah and Benjamin's genetic combination was producing this result consistently, predictably, with each conception. Martha's log entry from that fourth birth is brief and carries the weight of resignation. Another child born into suffering. God forgive us all. By this point, neighboring families had stopped visiting entirely. The general store owner in the nearest settlement began refusing to extend credit to the Caldwells, forcing Benjamin's cousins to make supply runs on the family's behalf, and even they did so with obvious reluctance, treating it as a burdensome obligation rather than family support. The isolation became nearly absolute. No children played near the Caldwell cabin. No women came to help Sarah with the overwhelming work of caring for multiple disabled children. No men offered Benjamin help with repairs or heavy tasks. The family existed in a bubble of rejection, their only regular contact with the outside world coming through Martha's visits. And even those felt increasingly uncomfortable, as if Martha herself was contaminated by association. Sarah and Benjamin continued because, and this is the part that's hardest to understand from our modern perspective, they likely didn't know how to stop. Contraception in the 1890s was primitive, often unreliable, and frequently prohibited on religious grounds. The rhythm method required understanding of fertility cycles that most people lacked. Barrier methods were expensive and hard to obtain in rural areas. For a couple living in isolation, without access to medical advice beyond Martha's visits, preventing pregnancy was nearly impossible. And there's another factor that Martha hints at in her later entries: the very human desire to keep trying, to hope that maybe, just maybe, the next child would be different. That whatever curse or genetic malfunction was causing this would skip one pregnancy, that they'd finally have a healthy baby who could grow up normal. It's the same impulse that makes people buy lottery tickets despite impossible odds, hope overriding statistical reality. Except in this case, every lost lottery was a child born into suffering. By 1895, everyone involved understood the pattern. Each pregnancy produced a child with severe abnormalities. Each birth compounded the family's isolation. Each new infant represented both a life saved, because Martha's skill kept them alive through dangerous deliveries, and a future circumscribed by physical limitations that would never improve. Yet Sarah's pregnancies continued, whether from lack of prevention knowledge, religious prohibition, or simply the stubborn human refusal to accept that hope was pointless. The first 4 children had established a horrifying precedent. What no one knew yet, what Martha would document with increasing despair over the next several years, was that they were only the beginning. The worst was still to come. Because if you think 4 children with severe disabilities was the endpoint, you haven't been paying attention to how these stories work. Nature wasn't done with the Caldwell family yet. Not even close. Between 1895 and early 1897, 4 more children were born. 4 more lives that arrived bearing the now familiar marks of genetic catastrophe, each one adding new variations to the nightmare that had become routine. Martha Combs continued attending the births because someone had to, but her logbook entries from this period read like dispatches from a war zone. Clinical details mixed with barely suppressed horror, professional obligation wrestling with moral exhaustion. The 5th child, born in autumn 1895, arrived with a cleft palate so severe that feeding became a dangerous, time-consuming ordeal. The split extended through the soft tissue of the mouth into the nasal cavity, making it nearly impossible for the infant to create the suction needed for nursing. Sarah had to feed her daughter drop by drop, angling her head carefully to prevent aspiration, spending hours on what should have taken minutes. The girl also had the now expected club feet, plus developmental delays that became apparent within weeks. She didn't track movement like infants should. Her muscle tone was weak. Something about her neurological development was fundamentally off. The 6th child, born in early 1896, pushed the boundaries of what seemed biologically possible. His left arm terminated at the elbow, not from injury or accident, but because it had simply stopped developing in utero. The bones, muscles, and tissue just ended, leaving a rounded stub where a forearm and hand should have been. His right leg was similarly incomplete, extending only to mid-thigh before stopping in a malformed joint that would never support weight. But he survived. Against every expectation, despite limbs that barely functioned, he survived the birth and continued breathing, eating, existing in a body that medical textbooks would have declared non-viable. Martha's notes from that delivery include a line that captures her state of mind. "I have delivered monsters into this world and can no longer pretend I am helping anyone." The word monsters is harsh, brutal even, but you have to understand the context. Martha wasn't being cruel. She was a midwife watching her life's work, bringing healthy children into the world, inverted into something nightmarish. Every skill she'd developed, every technique she'd mastered, was being used to perpetuate suffering. That knowledge was breaking her. Then came the poisoning, though it would take Dr. Garrett's later investigation to understand what had happened. By winter 1895, after 5 births and 5 catastrophic outcomes, Sarah and Benjamin were desperate. The medical establishment had offered them nothing. Dr. Garrett hadn't discovered them yet. They were isolated, terrified, watching their children suffer without any explanation or hope of change. Enter Elias Burke, a reclusive neighbor who claimed knowledge of old mountain remedies passed down from his grandfather, a man who supposedly knew how to fix children born wrong. Burke's explanation for their troubles sounded plausible to people with limited medical knowledge. Their affliction wasn't of blood or inheritance, but of blocked vitality, something that could be corrected through proper alignment of bodily humors. It was pseudoscience, dangerous nonsense dressed up in traditional language, but to Sarah and Benjamin it sounded like hope. Burke sold them a tonic, a crude mixture he claimed would thin the heavy blood and make their next child whole. The ingredients? Crushed lead filings, foxglove leaves, and alcohol. Benjamin took it daily for weeks, enduring the burning sensation in his throat, the nausea, the violent sickness it caused. Sarah joined him, mixing her doses with molasses to make them more palatable. They believed the suffering was necessary cleansing. That pain meant the remedy was working. In reality, they were poisoning themselves with substances known to cause severe congenital malformations. The seventh child, a girl born in autumn 1895, experienced seizures so severe that Benjamin's cousins had to transport the entire family 12 grueling miles to the town of Harlan for emergency treatment. The hospital records from that visit, which Garrett later obtained, paint a disturbing picture. The child had clear developmental delays, limited verbal ability, and a skull that showed premature fusion of cranial sutures. The bones of her head had closed too early, forcing her brain to grow against unyielding barriers. The attending physician recommended institutionalization, arguing that the child's medical needs exceeded what any family could manage in isolated mountain conditions. Sarah refused outright. She wouldn't send her children away to die alone among strangers, not after she'd been sent away herself, not after she knew exactly what that felt like. The physician's frustration is evident in his marginal notes, where he questioned whether keeping these children in such primitive conditions constituted a form of neglect, regardless of the parents' good intentions. The eighth child, born in June 1896, arrived missing his left kidney entirely. The right kidney had enlarged to compensate but functioned poorly, putting the boy in constant danger of renal failure. He also displayed syndactyly in all four limbs, fingers and toes webbed together in patterns that eliminated individual digit function. His hands looked like mittens, his feet like flippers. He could grip things crudely, but would never have the fine motor control that most people take for granted. By this point, daily survival for the family had become a choreography of impossible complexity. The oldest children, those who could walk despite their disabilities, attended to those who couldn't. James, now 6 years old, had learned to navigate on his clubbed feet using crudely carved crutches, dragging himself around the cabin to help with tasks. The eldest daughter, whose spinal curvature had worsened considerably, somehow managed her younger siblings despite chronic pain that must have been excruciating. Benjamin, confined to his reinforced chair, served as a stationary anchor around which everything revolved. He held infants while Sarah prepared food. He listened to the verbal children practice their letters. He'd taught himself to read during his years in the Louisville charity home and was determined to pass that knowledge on. Despite his immobility, he functioned as the family's emotional center, his gentle nature creating a refuge against the cruelty of the outside world. Sarah moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency born of desperate necessity. She'd devised feeding strategies for children with cleft palates. She'd discovered positioning techniques that eased breathing difficulties. She'd created a schedule that ensured each child received necessary care, though necessary care often meant choosing which child's needs were most urgent while others waited. Financial survival depended entirely on charity from Benjamin's increasingly reluctant cousins and occasional work James could perform for neighboring farms. Though his club feet made physical labor agonizing, and most farmers were hesitant to hire him anyway. The family raised a small garden, stretching every resource to its absolute limit. Medical care beyond Martha's midwifery remained financially impossible. That single hospital visit for the seventh child's seizures had taken 6 months to repay. 6 months of even more desperate poverty than usual. The isolation that had begun as geographic necessity had become absolute social quarantine. No neighbors visited. No children from other families played with the Caldwell offspring. The one attempt at church attendance, made in 1894 when Sarah still harbored hope for community acceptance, had ended when their arrival caused such visible discomfort that the preacher privately asked them not to return. The rejection was framed as concern for Sarah's difficulty traveling, but everyone understood the real reason. People didn't want to look at them, didn't want their children exposed to whatever curse seemed to hang over that family. Martha's journal entries from this period reveal her internal conflict with painful clarity. She described feeling complicit in ongoing tragedy, recognizing that her skill enabled pregnancies that probably should never happen. Yet she also understood that without her assistance, both mothers and infants would likely die, and however damaged these children were, they were still lives. Still human beings with inherent value, even if that value wasn't obvious to everyone. The moral weight of it clearly tormented her. She wrote about lying awake at night, replaying deliveries in her mind, wondering if there was a point where medical assistance became medical enabling. Where did duty end and harm begin? When did helping someone survive stop being mercy and start being cruelty? These weren't abstract ethical questions for Martha. They were lived reality, showing up every time Sarah's belly swelled with another pregnancy, every time she had to pack her bag and make the journey to that isolated cabin, knowing what she'd likely find when the baby emerged. What the logbook makes devastatingly clear is that by 1896, everyone involved understood the pattern with absolute certainty. Each pregnancy produced a child with severe abnormalities. Each birth compounded the family's isolation and desperation. Each new infant represented both a life that medical skill had saved and a future circumscribed by physical limitations that would never improve, that might only worsen as the child grew and the body's developmental errors compounded. Yet Sarah kept getting pregnant. Whether from lack of knowledge about preventing conception, religious prohibition against such prevention, or the very human desire to keep trying for that one healthy child, the pregnancies continued. And with each one, the family's circumstances grew more desperate, more isolated, more impossible to sustain. By early 1897, when Dr. Garrett finally made his first visit, the family consisted of 8 living children ranging from 6 years to a few months old. 8 children, each bearing multiple physical abnormalities, each requiring specialized care that strained the family's capacity beyond any reasonable limit. 8 lives that medical science insisted should not exist, yet somehow did, surviving through a combination of Martha's skill, Sarah's determination, Benjamin's steady emotional support, and sheer stubborn refusal to die despite bodies that seemed designed for failure. The community had written them off entirely by this point. The Caldwells existed in a bubble of isolation so complete it was almost like they'd ceased to exist for everyone else. Out of sight, out of mind, out of the moral calculations of neighbors who decided this family was either cursed by God or suffering the consequences of their own unnatural union. Either way, not their problem. And then that farmer stumbled onto their property while hunting, saw what he saw, and couldn't stay silent. His visit to Dr. Garrett's office set in motion a chain of events that would drag the Caldwell family from isolated obscurity into the glaring spotlight of medical scrutiny. Whether that attention would help them or harm them remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The family's private tragedy was about to become very, very public. And 4 more children were still to come, including the 2 who wouldn't survive, and the 12th who would mark the end of Sarah's childbearing years and complete the most comprehensive documentation of hereditary catastrophe that 19th century medicine would ever witness. Dr. Garrett's initial visit in March 1897 had shaken him to his core, but what transformed his curiosity into outright obsession was a letter that arrived 3 weeks later. Martha Combs, the midwife who'd been silently bearing witness to this tragedy for 7 years, had finally broken her silence. Her correspondence was brief but devastating. She described not 4 children as Garrett had initially seen, but 8, with 4 additional births having occurred between 1895 and 1896, while he'd remained completely ignorant of the family's existence. The letter carried the weight of someone unburdening themselves after years of carrying something too heavy alone. Martha needed help. The family needed help. And medicine needed to understand what was happening before Sarah got pregnant again. Because she would, Martha wrote with grim certainty, she absolutely would. Garrett returned to the Hollow in early April, this time prepared with proper measurement instruments, photographic equipment borrowed from a colleague in Lexington, and a determination to document everything with scientific precision. What he found exceeded even his expanded expectations. The 4 additional children displayed conditions that pushed the boundaries of medical possibility in ways that made his earlier observations seem almost tame by comparison. One boy, barely 2 years old, had organs arranged in mirror image to normal human anatomy, a condition called situs inversus that Garrett had only read about in European medical journals. His heart was positioned on the right side of his chest instead of the left. His liver occupied space where the stomach should be. His intestines coiled in reverse of normal patterns. Yet somehow, impossibly, he was alive and functioning. Another child had vertebrae so malformed that her neck couldn't support her head without assistance. She had to be propped constantly, or her head would loll to the side, putting dangerous pressure on her spinal cord. Garrett spent an entire week at the homestead, filling 3 notebooks with observations that grew increasingly detailed and disturbing. He measured skull circumferences, documented skeletal abnormalities, tested reflexes and cognitive responses with the crude diagnostic tools available in 1897. He photographed the children from multiple angles, creating visual records that would prove invaluable and controversial when published. The parents cooperated fully, perhaps hoping desperately that medical attention might somehow lead to treatment or cure. Benjamin, in particular, seemed hungry for answers, asking repeatedly whether doctors in cities like Louisville or Cincinnati might have remedies, whether there were specialists who could help his children. The questions broke Garrett's heart because he had no good answers to give. His scientific excitement at documenting such an unprecedented case warred constantly with growing ethical discomfort. These weren't laboratory specimens. They were suffering human beings trapped in bodies that betrayed them daily, and his examination, however thorough, however well-intentioned, couldn't change that fundamental reality. Garrett drafted a detailed report and sent copies to 3 prominent researchers whose work touched on heredity and developmental abnormalities: Dr. William Osler at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Charles Davenport at Harvard, and Dr. Horatio Wood in Philadelphia. He wrote with careful precision, anticipating skepticism, including measurements and photographic evidence to support his claims. Then he waited for responses that would validate his findings and bring the resources of academic medicine to bear on this extraordinary case. The responses, when they finally arrived months later, proved bitterly disappointing. Osler's reply was polite but dismissive, suggesting that Garrett had likely exaggerated the severity of the conditions or been somehow deceived by the parents about their blood relations. Davenport's response carried barely concealed condescension, implying that a country doctor lacked the training to accurately diagnose such complex conditions, that what Garrett was interpreting as multiple rare disorders was probably a handful of more common problems misidentified through inexperience. Only Wood showed genuine interest, though his letter raised disturbing questions about whether the parents might be more closely related than they claimed, suggesting consanguinity as the only logical explanation for such catastrophic results. Garrett fired back correspondence immediately, his frustration evident in the forceful language he used. He defended his observations with additional documentation, more photographs, detailed measurements, timeline charts showing the progression of pregnancies and births. He included copies of Martha's birth records, which corroborated everything he'd reported. He emphasized that neither parent showed any indication of shared ancestry, that their backgrounds traced to completely different regions of Kentucky and Ohio, and that their individual conditions alone, primordial dwarfism and pituitary dysfunction, might explain the hereditary disaster playing out in their children without requiring consanguinity as an additional factor. The dismissiveness stung deeply. Garrett had discovered something genuinely unprecedented, and the medical establishment was essentially patting him on the head and suggesting he didn't know what he was talking about. But their skepticism also hardened his resolve. If the experts wouldn't take him seriously based on written reports alone, he'd bring them to Kentucky. He'd make them see with their own eyes what he'd witnessed. He began researching every medical text he could obtain through interlibrary exchanges, searching for similar cases in recorded history. What he found were scattered references to individual conditions: children born with organ displacement, with severe skeletal malformations, with syndactyly or cleft palates. But nothing, absolutely nothing, that described a family where multiple severe abnormalities appeared across every single child without exception. The medical literature offered no framework for understanding what he was witnessing. The closest parallel came from veterinary science, where animal breeders had occasionally documented similar patterns when closely related animals were repeatedly bred together. But that required consanguinity, and Garrett had thoroughly investigated the parents' genealogies. They shared no common ancestors traceable through 4 generations on either side. In December 1896, Garrett wrote directly to Dr. Louise Barker, a rising researcher at Johns Hopkins known for challenging conventional medical thinking and taking on cases that other physicians found too controversial or complicated. This letter took a different approach. Garrett acknowledged that the case sounded impossible, admitted it challenged everything he'd learned in medical school, and then issued a direct challenge. Come see for yourself, or forever wonder if you dismissed the most important hereditary case study of the century. It was bold, perhaps even arrogant, but Garrett was past the point of polite academic deference. He'd witnessed something extraordinary, and if dramatic language was what it took to get someone with institutional authority to pay attention, so be it. 3 months passed with no response, and Garrett began to lose hope. Then, in March 1897, a telegram arrived that changed everything. Barker was coming to Kentucky, and he was bringing a team. The validation felt almost overwhelming. Finally, someone from the academic medical establishment was taking him seriously. Finally, he'd have witnesses with credentials that couldn't be dismissed. Finally, the Caldwell family might get the attention and resources they desperately needed. Garrett immediately sent word to Sarah and Benjamin, explaining that more doctors were coming, that these were important researchers from a prestigious hospital, that their examinations might lead to understanding and possibly even help. He tried to prepare them for what was coming. More invasive examinations, more questions, more strangers staring at their children's bodies. The parents received the news with the same resigned cooperation they'd shown throughout. If it might help their children, they'd endure anything. While Garrett awaited the Hopkins team's arrival, Sarah gave birth to her 9th child in February 1897, timing that would prove both tragic and scientifically valuable. The infant boy emerged with what the medical team would later document as multiple organ displacement even more severe than his older sibling's situs inversus. His heart was positioned partially on the right side of his chest. His liver occupied space where the stomach should reside. His intestines coiled in reverse of normal anatomy, creating a digestive system that barely functioned. Martha's hands trembled as she cleaned the newborn, recognizing that the internal chaos she couldn't see must be even worse than the external signs suggested. Yet the baby survived, first a week, then a month, defying every expectation. Feeding him required elaborate positioning to prevent aspiration, and he vomited frequently as his malformed digestive system struggled with basic function. But he lived, adding one more impossible case to the growing documentation. When Dr. Barker's team arrived in April 1897, they would find not 8 children but 9, including this fresh example of the genetic catastrophe still actively producing new victims. The stage was set for the most comprehensive examination of hereditary abnormality that 19th century medicine would ever conduct. The question was whether that examination would help the family or simply turn their private suffering into public spectacle. Dr. Louise Barker arrived in Harlan County on April 23, 1897, accompanied by 2 colleagues, Dr. Harold Fenton, a geneticist, and a medical photographer equipped with far superior equipment than anything Garrett possessed. Their journey from Baltimore had taken 5 days by train and horseback, and Barker's private correspondence, preserved in the Johns Hopkins Medical Archives, reveals he expected to debunk what he termed another example of rural medical hysteria. He anticipated finding a country doctor who'd misdiagnosed common conditions, exaggerated their severity, or been fooled by fabricated family histories. That expectation lasted approximately 5 minutes into the first examination. Barker's clinical notes, written in the precise language of academic medicine, document his shock at finding Garrett's descriptions actually understated the situation. He began systematically with the parents, confirming Sarah's primordial dwarfism through careful measurements and noting Benjamin's weight had increased to approximately 530 pounds. The pituitary dysfunction was obvious even without sophisticated testing. Benjamin's facial features showed characteristic coarsening. His hands were grotesquely enlarged. His breathing labored from sheer mass pressing on his lungs. Then Barker examined the children, working from oldest to youngest, and his professional composure began cracking. The photographic record he created provided unprecedented documentation of hereditary catastrophe. Each child was measured, tested for reflexes and cognitive function, assessed for internal abnormalities through the crude diagnostic tools available. What emerged from 3 days of intensive examination was a conclusion that defied contemporary genetic theory. The parents shared no common ancestry traceable through 4 generations on either side. Yet their children displayed a bewildering array of malformations, suggesting something far more complex than simple inheritance of parental traits. Fenton took detailed family histories, searching desperately for any overlooked connection that might explain consanguinity, because that was the only framework they had for understanding such results. He found nothing. The parents' bloodlines were completely separate in origin and mechanism. Barker's hypothesis, outlined in notes he shared with Fenton during long evenings at the local boarding house, proposed that each parent carried multiple recessive genetic factors beyond their obvious conditions, hidden defects that expressed catastrophically when combined through reproduction. The theory was remarkably close to Mendelian genetics, though Barker hadn't yet encountered Mendel's work, which remained obscure in American medical circles. He was essentially rediscovering principles of heredity through direct observation of their most extreme manifestation. The team documented specific patterns. Several children showed skeletal malformations similar in type, but varying in severity, suggesting a shared underlying genetic defect expressing differently. The organ displacement appeared in 3 separate children, always involving the same systems, but in unique configurations. Most troubling was the cognitive assessment. While some children demonstrated normal mental function despite physical limitations, others showed profound developmental delays that Fenton believed indicated brain malformation invisible to external examination. Barker's correspondence with Johns Hopkins during this period reveals growing conviction that this family represented a scientific opportunity that might never recur. He urged the university to fund a long-term study, proposing regular examinations to track how the children's conditions progressed. But he also raised an uncomfortable question that sparked heated debate among the team. Should Sarah and Benjamin be counseled against further pregnancies? And did medical professionals have any authority to enforce such counsel? Fenton argued passionately that preventing future births was a moral imperative given the suffering each child endured. The photographer, a religious man, insisted that only God held dominion over such decisions, that human interference with reproduction violated natural and divine law. Barker found himself caught between scientific fascination and human compassion, recognizing that every new child provided additional data while also representing another life condemned to physical agony. The ethical debate consumed their evenings, with no resolution emerging that satisfied everyone. Before leaving Kentucky, Barker sat with Benjamin and Sarah in the dimly lit cabin, explaining as gently as possible what his examination had revealed. Their children's conditions stemmed from unfortunate combination of genetic factors both parents carried, factors that had nothing to do with sin or curse or divine judgment, but simply biological misfortune. Each pregnancy was essentially a genetic lottery with impossibly bad odds, rolling dice that kept coming up catastrophe. Benjamin asked the question that had haunted him for years, his voice barely above a whisper. Was there any chance a future child might be born healthy? Barker's answer, documented in his notes, was devastatingly honest. Based on the pattern across 9 births, the statistical probability approached 0. Every child they conceived would almost certainly suffer similar or worse abnormalities. There was no cure, no treatment, no intervention that could change those odds. Sarah's response was silence. She didn't weep or protest or argue. She simply nodded, as if Barker had confirmed something she'd long suspected but never wanted to acknowledge. Then she asked if the doctors could at least help the children they already had, ease their pain, correct some of the deformities, give them better lives than they currently had. And Barker had to tell her no. The medical technology didn't exist. Surgery was too dangerous, anesthesia too primitive. Most of the conditions were untreatable even if they'd had access to the best hospitals in America. All medicine could offer was documentation, understanding, and the cold comfort of knowing that their family's tragedy would advance scientific knowledge. 3 months later, Sarah discovered she was pregnant with her 10th child. When word reached Garrett, he felt something close to despair. When word reached Barker in Baltimore, he felt scientific excitement mixed with profound ethical discomfort. And when Martha Combs found out, she wrote in her journal, "God forgive me. I have become midwife to catastrophe." The 10th pregnancy would test everyone's limits, medical, ethical, and human. What came next would force hard questions about where science's responsibility began and ended, and whether documenting suffering was enough when you couldn't stop it. The tonic arrived at the Caldwell cabin in winter 1895, months before Dr. Garrett's discovery of the family, during the desperate period between the fourth and fifth births when Sarah and Benjamin had lost all faith in their circumstances improving naturally. Elias Burke, the reclusive neighbor who'd brought it, presented himself as their salvation, a man who understood what doctors did not, who possessed knowledge passed down through generations of mountain healers. His grandfather, he claimed, had helped fix children born wrong through proper restoration of the body's natural balance. The medical establishment, Burke insisted with the confidence of the ignorant, didn't understand that their affliction wasn't about blood or heredity. It was about blocked vitality, about humors that had fallen out of alignment, about forces in the body that needed correction before they could produce healthy offspring. To Sarah and Benjamin, isolated and desperate, this explanation sounded plausible. They'd seen no doctors except Martha, who delivered their children but offered no solutions. They had no understanding of genetics or heredity beyond folk wisdom about traits running in families. When Burke explained that their bodies were simply imbalanced, that a proper remedy could thin the heavy blood and clear the channels through which life force flowed, it gave them something they hadn't had in years: hope with a specific action attached. Burke sold them the tonic for what little money Benjamin's cousins could spare, a dark liquid in an unlabeled bottle that smelled of alcohol and bitterness. He instructed Benjamin to take it daily, Sarah to begin once her current pregnancy ended. The suffering it caused, he assured them, was proof it was working. Pain meant cleansing. Sickness meant the remedy was driving out corruption. They needed to endure through the worst of it to reach the healing on the other side. Benjamin started immediately, drinking the prescribed dose each morning. It burned going down, left his throat raw, made his stomach heave with nausea. Within days, he was experiencing violent episodes of vomiting that left him weak and shaking. But Burke had prepared him for this. The worse the reaction, he'd said, the more poison needed purging. So Benjamin endured, trusting that the agony meant progress. Sarah watched her husband suffer and felt her own hope wavering. But Benjamin insisted. They had to try everything. For the children they already had, for the ones yet to come, they had to believe something could change. When the fifth child was born in autumn 1895 with her severe cleft palate and developmental delays, Sarah joined the regimen. She mixed her doses with molasses to make them more palatable, choking down the bitter mixture twice daily as Burke had instructed. The effects were similar: burning, nausea, weakness. But she persisted because the alternative was accepting that every future child would be born suffering, and that acceptance felt like a form of death itself. The sixth pregnancy came early in 1896, and both parents continued the tonic throughout, believing they were building up the cumulative effect Burke had promised. When labor began, Sarah convinced herself she could feel something different, that maybe the remedy had worked. Martha Combs attended the birth with her usual professional competence, though she noticed Sarah seemed more ill than previous pregnancies, paler, weaker, experiencing more severe cramping. The baby arrived after a difficult labor, and what emerged stopped Martha's breath. His left arm ended abruptly at the elbow, the right leg twisted backward at the knee, deformities worse than anything she'd documented before. Martha's journal entry from that night is brief but pointed. They sought healing from what poisons the earth itself, and the earth answered. She'd noticed the bottles in the cabin, the smell on their breath, but hadn't connected it to the worsening conditions until that moment. It was Dr. Garrett, during his later investigations, who discovered the full truth. He found remnants of the tonic in the cabin during one of his visits, examined the bottle's faded label. Burke and Sons Pharmaceutical Remedies, Lexington. The company no longer existed by 1897, but Garrett tracked down their old formulations through medical society records. What he found made him physically ill. The tonic contained lead acetate, used historically as a sweetener despite being highly toxic, and foxglove extract, the source of digitalis, a heart medication that in improper doses caused severe poisoning. Both substances were known to cross the placental barrier. Both were capable of causing congenital malformations in utero. Modern analysis, conducted decades later when the case was revisited by medical historians, confirmed the toxicity. Lead exposure during pregnancy could cause neural tube defects, skeletal malformations, organ damage, exactly the kinds of problems that had worsened in the sixth child compared to earlier births. Foxglove, when taken in the crude extract form Burke had prepared rather than carefully measured pharmaceutical doses, could disrupt fetal heart development and overall growth patterns. Sarah and Benjamin had been poisoning themselves and their unborn children while believing they were healing. The cruel irony was almost unbearable. They'd endured burning throats and violent sickness, thinking it meant purging corruption, when in fact they were introducing new corruption with every dose. The sixth child's severe deformities weren't just the result of their genetic combination. They were compounded by toxic exposure during the most critical stages of development. When Garrett gently explained this to the parents during a later visit, Benjamin wept. Not the quiet tears of sadness, but great heaving sobs that shook his massive frame. They'd been trying to help. They'd been trying so desperately to give their children a better chance. And instead they'd made it worse. Sarah's reaction was different, a kind of hollow silence, as if one more layer of hope had been stripped away, leaving nothing beneath. She asked Garrett if any of the damage could be undone, if the sixth child might improve once the poisons cleared from his system. Garrett had to tell her no. The damage was done during formation, during the critical weeks when organs and limbs were developing. There was no reversing it. It was one more tragedy born not of cruelty or neglect, but of desperate hope meeting dangerous ignorance. Two outcasts clinging to folk remedies in a world that had already abandoned them, making everything worse while trying so hard to make it better. The 10th child arrived in February 1898, and from the moment she drew her first breath, or rather, struggled to draw it, everyone present understood this was different. Martha's birth records describe a labor complicated by the infant's failure to breathe independently for the first 12 minutes of life. 12 minutes. Martha worked frantically, clearing airways, stimulating the tiny chest, performing every technique she knew to trigger that first crucial breath. When respiration finally began, it remained shallow and irregular, each inhale sounding wet and labored. The baby had been born with a cleft palate that extended through the soft tissue into the nasal cavity, but examination revealed something far worse. Her chest wall had developed incompletely, leaving portions of her lungs partially exposed beneath translucent skin. You could see them moving, the pink tissue expanding and contracting beneath a membrane so thin it seemed impossible it could protect anything. Garrett, who attended the birth alongside Martha, immediately sent word to Dr. Barker. The Hopkins physician arrived within 2 weeks, accompanied by a specialist in pulmonary conditions, both driven by scientific fascination and genuine concern. Their examination confirmed that the infant's survival defied medical logic. The exposed lung tissue should have led to immediate infection and death, bacteria from the environment entering directly into pulmonary tissue, overwhelming an immune system that couldn't possibly fight back effectively. Yet somehow the child clung to life, wheezing and struggling, but alive. Barker's photographs from this visit show an infant whose physical form seemed barely viable, held together by biological processes no one could explain. The images are difficult to look at even now, preserved in medical archives as testament to how far genetic catastrophe had pushed this family. Sarah became pregnant again before the 10th child reached 6 months of age. The news reached Garrett through Martha, whose frustration had transformed into something darker, a kind of resigned despair. Her journal entry from July 1898 reads, "I have delivered suffering into this world for 8 years and can no longer pretend I am helping anyone. Each birth adds to agony that never ends." The 11th pregnancy progressed differently from the start. Sarah, now 37 and physically devastated by a decade of childbearing, experienced complications from the beginning. Severe cramping in her 4th month suggested twins, confirmed when Martha's experienced hands detected 2 separate heartbeats. The delivery in January 1899 became the worst Martha would ever record. The twins were born 6 weeks premature, their bodies tiny even by Sarah's diminished standards. Both boys displayed overlapping catastrophic conditions, spina bifida, leaving portions of their spinal cords exposed through gaps in the vertebrae, hearts with malformed chambers that created audible murmurs, cranial development so disrupted that their skulls appeared soft and pliable where bone should have fused. They shared one additional horror that Martha documented with shaking hands. Their digestive systems had developed incompletely, lacking proper connection between stomach and intestines. Food, if they could even swallow it, had nowhere to go. The first twin died within 18 hours. Sarah held him until his shallow breathing simply stopped, his tiny chest going still in her arms. The second survived 4 days, sustained by Sarah's desperate attempts at nursing despite the absolute futility. She knew he couldn't process the milk, knew his malformed digestive system couldn't sustain him, but she tried anyway because what else could she do? Watch her son starve without even attempting to feed him? Benjamin, from his chair in the next room, listened to the infant's weakening cries grow fainter each day until they stopped entirely. Barker, notified by telegram, arrived too late to examine them living, but performed post-mortem examinations that revealed the full extent of internal chaos. His report to Johns Hopkins, written in clinical language that barely masked his shock, described organs that had formed in approximate but non-functional arrangements, as if the genetic instructions for human development had been scrambled beyond recognition. Hearts with chambers that didn't connect properly, intestines that looped and twisted without forming continuous pathways, kidneys that were present but structurally wrong in ways that precluded function. These were the first deaths among Sarah and Benjamin's children. 9 had survived against impossible odds. These 2 could not. The graves were dug on the property, marked with wooden crosses that Benjamin carved himself, one of the few tasks his limited mobility still allowed. No preacher would come to perform services. The family buried their sons alone, Sarah and Benjamin and their 9 living children standing in the cold January wind, while Martha Combs said what prayers she could remember. It was the first time the family had to acknowledge that survival wasn't guaranteed, that some combinations of genetic catastrophe were simply incompatible with life, no matter how strong the will to live. 3 months later, Sarah discovered she was pregnant for the 12th time. Garrett's correspondence with Barker reveals his horror at this news. He'd hoped the twin deaths might finally convince the couple to stop, though he acknowledged they likely lacked both knowledge and means to prevent conception. Barker's response was coldly scientific. One more pregnancy would complete the statistical sample, providing data on a full dozen offspring from this unique genetic combination. The 12th child, a girl born in November 1899, arrived with conditions that combined elements seen in her siblings but arranged in new configurations. She had the webbed digits of her brother, the spinal curvature of her eldest sister, developmental delays immediately apparent in her weak muscle tone and inability to focus her eyes. Additionally, her left arm had formed without a hand, terminating in a smooth stub at the wrist. By the century's end, the Caldwell family consisted of 10 living children and 2 buried in mountain soil. Sarah's body, ravaged by 12 pregnancies in 10 years, would bear no more. Whether by biological mercy or simple reproductive exhaustion, her childbearing years had concluded. The family that medical science had documented so thoroughly was now complete, frozen in time as a testament to genetic catastrophe that 19th century medicine could document but not prevent, explain but not remedy. The question now was what would happen to them, and whether the attention they'd received would help or ultimately destroy what remained of their lives. Dr. Barker's comprehensive report reached the Journal of Heredity in March 1900, accompanied by photographs, detailed measurements, and genealogical charts documenting 3 generations of both parental lines. The response from the medical establishment was immediate and viciously divided. What followed was an 18-month battle that exposed deep fractures in how science approached human suffering, ethics, and the fundamental question of who got to decide which lives were worth living. The initial publication in July 1900 sparked outrage from unexpected quarters. Dr. Edmund Sterling, a prominent Boston physician, published a scathing response arguing that detailed documentation of such cases served no legitimate scientific purpose. His letter, reprinted in several medical periodicals, claimed that parading human deformity before the medical community degraded both the profession and the unfortunate subjects. He questioned whether the family had truly consented to such invasive examination or whether their poverty and isolation had made refusal impossible. The photographs especially troubled him. Were they educational tools or merely grotesque curiosities that satisfied morbid interest under the guise of science? Barker defended his work in subsequent issues, insisting that understanding hereditary mechanisms required unflinching examination of extreme cases. Without documentation, medicine would remain trapped in superstition and ignorance. The Caldwell family represented a natural experiment in human genetics that might never be replicated. Refusing to study them would be a betrayal of scientific duty. Progress required difficult choices, uncomfortable truths, and willingness to observe what nature presented even when it disturbed our sensibilities. Then the eugenics movement discovered the case, and everything became exponentially worse. Dr. Albert Hrdlicka, a vocal advocate for selective breeding policies, seized on Barker's findings as proof that certain individuals should be legally prevented from reproducing. His article in the American Journal of Public Health in October 1900 used the Caldwell children as evidence that the state had a responsibility to intervene when genetic unfitness was apparent. Hrdlicka proposed legislation requiring sterilization of individuals with severe hereditary conditions, citing Sarah and Benjamin as examples of people who should never have been allowed to marry, much less have children. This appropriation of the research horrified Barker. His private correspondence reveals a man wrestling with unintended consequences, realizing too late that scientific findings could be weaponized in ways he'd never anticipated. He'd sought to advance medical knowledge, not provide ammunition for those advocating governmental control over human reproduction. Yet once published, his findings took on lives beyond his control. Eugenics advocates across America began referencing the Kentucky case as justification for increasingly extreme policies: forced sterilization, marriage restrictions, institutionalization of the genetically unfit. The Caldwell children became poster cases for everything wrong with allowing defectives to breed freely. Dr. Harold Fenton, who'd accompanied Barker on the initial examination, broke publicly with his colleague over this issue. In a letter published in February 1901, Fenton argued that continued study of the family had become exploitation. The children's suffering served no therapeutic purpose, and the documentation had devolved into a grotesque catalog that satisfied curiosity without offering help. He revealed details that Barker had omitted from official reports. Several children had wept from pain and fear during examinations. Sarah had asked repeatedly whether the doctors could make her children normal, and when told they could not, she'd asked why they kept returning. The controversy reached its peak when a Philadelphia newspaper obtained photographs from the case file and published them without permission in April 1901. The images meant for medical education appeared alongside sensationalized text describing the family as genetic horrors and nature's mistakes. Public reaction was swift and cruel. Letters to the editor debated whether such individuals should be isolated from society, with some suggesting the children be removed to institutions for public safety. Others argued the parents should face legal consequences for willfully bringing damaged children into the world despite knowing the risks. The few sympathetic voices were drowned out by a tide of opinion that these lives represented mistakes that modern science should prevent from occurring in the future. Garrett, watching from Kentucky, found himself caught between scientific duty and human decency. He'd initiated contact with academic medicine, believing it would help the family. Instead, he'd exposed them to judgment far beyond anything their isolated mountain community had inflicted. Medical students were requesting permission to visit for educational purposes. Photographers sought access to create more images. Even a traveling show promoter inquired about exhibiting the family, offering payment that Sarah and Benjamin desperately needed but refused with quiet dignity. The debate in medical journals continued through 1902 with no consensus emerging. Some physicians argued the case demonstrated why hereditary research was essential. Only through understanding could prevention become possible. Others insisted it proved such research was inherently unethical when subjects couldn't meaningfully consent and received no benefit from participation. The eugenics faction continued citing the family as justification for increasingly draconian policies, while civil liberties advocates warned that medical paternalism threatened fundamental human rights. Who decided which lives were worth living? Who determined when genetic burden justified state intervention? Where did scientific duty end and human dignity begin? Lost entirely in the academic warfare were the actual subjects. 10 children growing older with conditions that would never improve, living in poverty that made daily survival a struggle. Parents aging rapidly under impossible burdens, watching their children suffer while the medical world debated their case in abstract terms. A family that had become, against their will, a symbol in debates they barely understood and certainly never asked to join. The question nobody seemed willing to address was the simplest and most damning. Now that medicine had documented their existence so thoroughly, photographed them, measured them, turned them into case studies discussed in medical schools across the country, what responsibility did science have to actually help them? The answer, it seemed, was none. Documentation was enough. Understanding was its own reward. The Caldwell family had given medicine valuable data about heredity, and in return they received nothing but unwanted fame and continued isolation. The scientific community had taken what it needed and moved on to the next interesting case, leaving behind real people whose suffering continued long after the journals stopped publishing articles about them. While medical journals debated ethics and eugenics advocates exploited their existence, the Caldwell family continued the grinding work of daily survival. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, because beyond the clinical observations and controversy, real life was happening in that isolated cabin. Records from the Harlan County School Board, discovered in storage decades later, reveal that in 1900 a young teacher named Grace Holloway, newly arrived from Lexington, learned of the family's situation and insisted that those children capable of attending school deserved education. Her diary, donated to the Kentucky Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1973, provides the most intimate portrait of the family beyond medical observation, and it changes everything we think we know about their story. Grace's first visit in September 1900 described a household that functioned through carefully orchestrated routines that would put most families to shame. The oldest daughter, despite her severe spinal curvature that twisted her torso sideways, managed the younger children with surprising competence. She developed techniques for feeding those with cleft palates, positioning those who couldn't sit upright, coordinating care with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice. James, now 9 years old with club feet that had never straightened, had learned to walk using crudely carved crutches and helped his father with tasks requiring mobility. What struck Grace most was that 3 children possessed clear mental capacity for formal education. James, one of the younger girls despite her physical limitations, and surprisingly, one of the twins with cranial malformation whose cognitive abilities had developed normally despite his appearance. She began visiting twice weekly, bringing primers and teaching materials, and her entries revealed children hungry for knowledge, eager to prove themselves capable despite bodies that society deemed monstrous. The community's attitude had begun shifting incrementally by this point. Benjamin's cousins, perhaps shamed by academic attention or simply worn down by years of need, convinced several neighboring families to contribute supplies. A local carpenter constructed specialized furniture adapted to the children's needs, including a remarkable chair for the child whose neck couldn't support her head, designed with padding and support that allowed her to sit comfortably for the first time. These were small mercies, but they represented cracks in the wall of isolation that had surrounded the family for years. Grace's diary documented the family's internal dynamics with remarkable clarity. Sarah, aged beyond her 38 years, maintained iron discipline over household management. She devised feeding strategies, discovered positioning that eased breathing difficulties, created schedules that ensured each child received necessary care. Her competence contradicted every assumption about someone of her size and background being unable to manage such complexity. Benjamin, immobile in his reinforced chair, served as the family's intellectual foundation. He'd taught himself considerable knowledge from borrowed books and engaged his children in discussions about history, mathematics, and moral philosophy with clarity that rivaled trained educators. Grace recorded conversations where Benjamin explained concepts that left her genuinely impressed. His physical imprisonment had forced development of mental resources that might otherwise have remained dormant. The reality Grace documented stood in stark contrast to medical reports focused solely on pathology. Yes, the children suffered. Yes, their conditions caused constant pain and limitation. But they also laughed, quarreled like normal siblings, showed distinct preferences and personalities. The girl with webbed hands had taught herself to draw by gripping charcoal between her paddle-like appendages, creating surprisingly detailed sketches of birds and flowers. The boy with reversed organs sang constantly, his voice clear and strong despite the chaos inside his chest. One of the twins had memorized entire Bible passages Benjamin read aloud and would recite them with perfect accuracy. Yet Grace never descended into sentimentality. She recorded the seizures that struck without warning, the infections that threatened fragile lives, the slow deterioration of conditions that would never improve. She described Sarah's exhaustion on days when 3 children simultaneously needed intensive care, Benjamin's frustration at being unable to physically help during crises. One entry from December 1900 reveals the family's awareness of their notoriety. James asked Grace why doctors kept coming to stare at them, but never made them better. She had no good answer. The boy, 12 years old and perceptive beyond his years, told her he understood they were valuable to science, but wondered if science valued them as people. By 1901, 5 children attended Grace's lessons regularly. 2 had learned to read at grade appropriate levels. 1 showed remarkable aptitude for arithmetic, solving problems in his head faster than Grace could write them. These achievements would never appear in medical journals obsessed with cataloging physical failures. Yet Grace's diary preserved them as testament that even lives born into genetic catastrophe contain moments of genuine achievement and thoroughly ordinary human experience. The paper trail grows heartbreakingly sparse after 1906. Benjamin died in November 1905, his overworked heart finally giving out. His death removed the family's emotional foundation and eliminated any possibility of male labor, however limited. Sarah, now 44 and physically broken, found herself solely responsible for 8 remaining children whose needs exceeded what any single person could manage. No children are mentioned. Death certificates for the 8 remaining children don't appear in official records, suggesting burial on the property without documentation, a common practice for the very poor in rural areas. Whether they died separately over those 5 years or from some collective tragedy like illness or fire remains unknown. The historical record simply stops, as if the family vanished into the Kentucky mountains that had hidden them for so long. Sarah's death certificate, dated July 1913, lists her age incorrectly as 42 and cause as general debility. She was found by Benjamin's cousins after several days had passed, alone in the dwelling that had housed such improbable life. The county buried her beside Benjamin and their children in graves that received no markers beyond wooden crosses that weather eventually destroyed. The medical papers documenting the Caldwell family gathered dust in academic archives for decades, the case that had sparked such controversy fading into obscurity. But in 1983, when the Historical Society finally placed a marker at the unmarked burial site, the simple granite stone bore only names and dates, no medical terminology, just a community's belated acknowledgement that these had been people whose lives mattered beyond their contribution to scientific understanding. The Caldwell family's story doesn't end with that granite marker in the Kentucky mountains. It echoes forward through time in ways Sarah and Benjamin could never have imagined. Their tragedy, documented so thoroughly by physicians who could observe but not help, became foundational to our modern understanding of genetic inheritance. The debates their case sparked about ethics, consent, and scientific responsibility still rage today in different forms. When we argue about genetic testing, about designer babies, about who decides which lives are worth living, we're having the same conversation that tore through medical journals in 1901. But here's what strikes me most about this story. Beyond the medical terminology, beyond the ethical debates, beyond even the genetic catastrophe itself, there was love. A mother who refused to abandon her children despite a world that told her they were mistakes. A father who taught them to read while unable to stand. Children who drew pictures and sang songs and learned arithmetic despite bodies that betrayed them daily. A teacher who saw past the deformities to the minds inside. That's the part the medical establishment missed entirely, so focused on documenting what was wrong that they forgot to see what was right. The Caldwell family survived in a world that offered them nothing. They created moments of normalcy, of joy even, in circumstances that should have crushed them. They loved each other when society wouldn't love them. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not about genetics or heredity or medical ethics, but about the stubborn human refusal to be reduced to our worst circumstances. About dignity maintained when the world offers none. About the fact that every life, no matter how damaged, contains something that cannot be measured in medical journals or captured in photographs taken for scientific study. We'll never know what happened to those children in their final years. History swallowed them the same way it swallows most people whose lives don't fit neat narratives. But we know they existed. We know they mattered. And we know that somewhere in the Kentucky mountains, marked by a simple granite stone, lies a family that gave science invaluable knowledge while receiving almost nothing in return except the dubious honor of being remembered as a cautionary tale. So here's my question for you. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about medical history, about disability, about what it means to be human, what are you going to do with that? How does knowing the Caldwell family's story change how you see the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm genuinely curious what resonates with you about this story. If you found value in this deep dive into forgotten history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of people who believe that the stories history tried to bury are often the ones most worth telling. Share this video with someone who appreciates real, unflinching examinations of the past, the kind that don't shy away from difficult truths, but also don't forget the humanity at the center of every tragedy. And remember, behind every case study, every medical record, every statistic that advances scientific knowledge, there are real people living real lives. The Caldwell family deserved better than they got from the world. The least we can do is remember them not as specimens or symbols, but as human beings who survived against impossible odds with their dignity intact. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.